Let's just start with a basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other, that there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. Is some contestation and conflict over how you teach about race, racial hierarchies, critically, racism in schools and society. And so the two are being conflated.
And so when you hear people talking repeatedly about critical race theory, what is your thought?
When I hear people talking about critical race theory, I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological, in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society. So, there are a number of, I read a really good article just yesterday in the New Yorker about...
We don't talk about these things. We all did learn about...
You don't want them talked about?
No, that's not true either.
You want to cancel them?
No, Malcolm, I'm sorry, you're lying. That's lying.
That's just that
it is lying. I've personally talked about many of the things that you just mentioned. I define critical race theory by citing the actual authors of critical race theory, and you seem to be a pretty good beneficiary of the meritocracy because you have merit, Malcolm. So if you're going to criticize the meritocracy as an outgrowth of white supremacy, then you're going to have to tear down the system that you've succeeded in because you have merit, or do not have merit.
When my great-great-grandfather ran away from slavery to join the 111th U.S. Colored Troops and fight against the South, keeping human beings as slaves, he didn't think, you know what, in 150 years, my great-great-grandson's going to have to sit on stage and argue with a guy who thinks all that's bullshit. All right? I'm just saying,
Malcolm,
there is no controversy. The controversy that's made up is people saying that this is being discussed, this is being taught in schools, and that kids should be kept away from it.
That's not true.
It's not even a real controversy.
Malcolm, the fifth largest school district in America, Clark County, just decided that they were going to lower standards with regard to testing because they wanted to alleviate disparities in outcomes. That is an outgrowth of critical race theory.
Can you draw a straight line to it?
Yes.
Really?
100%, because when you say that the meritocracy is an outgrowth of white supremacy, and then you suggest that I'm somehow denying that slavery took place, or that your great-great-great-grandfather was a hero, because I'm saying that I want people tested when they are in school to see if they are good at school, then what you're purporting to push now is just nonsense. I'm sorry, it's sheer bullshit, Malcolm. It's just bullshit.
But I think it's also a leap to say that he thought that was bullshit. Because that's not what it is. I mean, are we talking about 2021? Or are we talking about 1861?
Everyone in Loudoun County sees it that way.
I mean, there were parents that were just sick of it. They were just sick of, constantly being told, if you don't agree with me, then, you're a racist.
Ian Pryor's two daughters are in elementary school here. He's a former Trump administration Justice Department spokesman, now leading a group called Fight for Schools, a political action committee pushing back on equity and inclusion measures.
We're not about not teaching history. We're about teaching history in an objective way that is not represented as America is systemically racist.
When you're looking not at individual acts of racism, but the systemic racism that exists within America's educational institutions, what would you suggest be done right now?
So there's a balancing act here of making sure that there's equal opportunity for all, that we're committed to meritocracy, but also that when we are trying to figure out how to deal with any kind of social problems, we do not overstep and overreact.
There's 2 signs right there.
Parents who agree with Pryor are now part of a growing chorus opposing what's known as critical race theory, or CRT, often a graduate-level framework that examines how the legacy of slavery and segregation in America is embedded in legal systems and policies. The thing is, critical race theory isn't being taught here, but that didn't stop dozens of parents from flooding a recent school board meeting to protest it.
The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our schools.
I will do everything I possibly can to fight to the bitter end until you prove to me that you are not teaching my children that they are racist just because they're white.
That outrage echoes messaging ricocheting across right-wing media.
Critical race theory is racist.
I don't see critical race theory, in our Declaration of Independence.
Much of this can be traced back to a September 2020 directive by then-President Trump, instructing agencies to identify and halt funding of anti-bias training for federal employees that suggests, quote, the United States is an inherently racist or evil country. On his first day in office, President Biden used an executive order to revoke the Trump administration's action.
When I hear the talk of critical race theory, I immediately get a signal. It's an alarming system for me because it's a misrepresentation and misuse of the word.
Jalea Lyles-Dunn is the Director of Learning for Justice, which offers resources for teachers to create anti-bias learning experiences.
Culturally relevant, anti-racist instruction models needed. We need a classroom set up, so not just instruction, but we also need a space that lets children know you are welcome here. Inclusive education is a space where we all are at the table together. We all hear everyone's story.
The debate over...
Well, what do y'all think? It's going to be a good one. We're going to talk about it. Should critical race theory be taught? Basically, it's really code is critical race theory code words for history, American history. I don't know, man. Let's talk about it. Let's see what's happening. Y'all meet us here on Sunday, and let's talk about it. Let's see what's happening. All right, y'all. Peace.